Thank you for joining the Essential Therapies podcast. Dr. Cindy Hodgson here. I'm a physical therapist and an exercise physiologist, and I am super excited today to have Dr. Tom Seager, who's associate professor at Arizona State University in engineering of all things, but he is an absolute expert in ice baths and how our body responds to the ice bath metabolically and psychologically. So Tom, I have a million things I want to bring up, but I'm sure we will just weave through whatever. Tell us a little more about you in that introduction. I know is not near enough to explain how much you have covered this. And I have more to say about how I found you, but tell us a little more about you.
I think you got it right, Cindy. I'm a professor of engineering, and so you might ask, what the heck am I doing in health and wellness? But my specialty, it was always environmental engineering. Environmental engineering has been that branch concerned with public health. It originated in the cholera epidemic of the 19th century, in Victorian England, when we discovered that it was contaminated water that was killing people. That was the genesis of environmental engineering. So I did my doctorate there. And then I kind of strayed away from that classic sort of toxicological infectious disease because I thought all the important problems there had been solved. I went into disaster response. I got into sustainability and resilient infrastructure systems. And boy, was I wrong about the interesting problems in public health being solved because COVID and the lockdowns revealed that metabolic health is the key to all health. Every single leading cause of death from chronic illness in the United States originates in metabolic disorder. So I've rearranged my entire research career. Now I build machines like ice baths that allow people to restore their mitochondrial function, to fix their metabolic dysfunction, and avoid what ordinarily medicine would call aging. Aging is optional. We can maintain high metabolic quality of life, including fertility and sex function and vitality and sharp cognition for decades past what most people think, well, they just have to live with because they're getting older.
I absolutely agree. And you know what I call those ideas are essential therapies. And that's kind of what I have been doing for over 30 years now as well. With my interest initially was in nutrition and biochemistry. So here I was taking all this biochemistry and planning to go down this nutrition route. And I kept seeing all of these things that didn't make sense. And I would say, well, and I'm in health and wellness. I was exercise physiology. And I'm seeing all of this in the biochemistry world. At the university where I was, I had to take graduate level biochem in the pharmacology department. And so when I would ask questions like, well, okay, why are we telling people to eat 6 small meals a day, mostly carbohydrate, when it does this to insulin and then insulin does this, and why are we doing that? And the answer I would get when I'd ask that question was silence. And it was like the first time the professor said, I don't know, this is pharmacology, not wellness, and then went on to the next question or the next topic,
I was in my graduate toxicology class. Here I am, a doctoral student, and it was taught by someone who was on the scientific advisory board of the US EPA. So this was an eminent environmental chemist. And he taught in our toxicology class, old age causes cancer. I couldn't accept that. It lost all credibility in my mind. He thought that cancer was the inevitable consequence of old age. He had no curiosity about the underlying mechanisms of cancer. Well, the prevailing theory at the time was that cancer originates in defects of the nucleus. The DNA in the nucleus accumulates over time, defects that can't be repaired, and then it causes aberrant function within the cell. We know that's wrong. Thomas Seyfried, for example, at Boston College, has shown us that that's wrong. Cancer originates in disorders of metabolism. It is the mitochondria that are damaged, not the DNA in the nucleus. The damage to the DNA in the nucleus is downstream of the mitochondrial dysfunction. He's done the experiments that demonstrate that. So how should we approach cancer therapies? Metabolically. And what little has been done on metabolic therapies to treat cancer is very promising, especially when you compare it to radiation and chemotherapy, in which there have been hundreds of billions of dollars of research pouring through the National Cancer Institute and the National Institute for Health, which hasn't done a dang thing to improve outcomes or life expectancies among cancer patients. So it's a good example of how what we learned in graduate school was a bunch of lies that were
Yeah.
driven by a profit-making agenda. Most of the
Mhm.
continuing education credits, for example, available to physicians in the United States, are funded by pharmaceutical companies,
Mhm.
and they're oriented towards keeping people in a state of chronic illness because that's
Mhm.
the most profitable state for pharmaceutical companies to sell them more things.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's just a continual thing that is happening across the board. And as far as this metabolism thing, it was something that I asked. In fact, you bring this up in this book. Well, I should probably mention this because we're getting off.
You're
Um,
reading Uncommon Testosterone.
yes,
That's terrific. Thank you.
yeah, I
Yeah.
read it. It's amazing, and there's lots of things scribbled in here. I wrote up about Thomas Siegfried as an example. So keto diets and carnivore diets, this low carb setting is where I've been spending a lot of time the last few years and learning about. Of course, I learned the exact opposite years ago, but way back when, again, in graduate school, we're talking about cancer and they're saying how cancer feeds off of glucose. Even then, it's like, it's not rocket science to ask the question, well, then why are we not just eliminating all glucose in these cancer patients and see what happens? You
And in
know,
fact, the hospitals are doing just the opposite. You
oh,
might
jars
report
of
to the
candy
hospital for
and yeah,
chemotherapy,
yeah,
and they'll give you Jello and orange juice and never mind the seed oils, just ultra processed refined foods
yeah,
to their chemotherapy patients. They have
yeah.
soda machines on pediatric cancer floors inside hospitals. What the hell is that?
It's
And
mind blowing. It's mind blowing,
right.
and I'm done like being quiet, right? Or asking questions. I mean, this is common sense, and I think people have common sense and they just don't know. And so I one of my favorite sayings is, when you don't know what you don't know, you can be in a lot of trouble, or you can find yourself in a situation that you don't want to be in. So I've been forever asking myself, well, what is it that I don't know? Like, let's find this stuff out, right? So I ended up seeing these little signs about metabolism, and that was making me very curious. In fact, I even did a paper on glycolysis, where how we measure HbA1c, and that's to tell us if someone has diabetes or have a tendency towards it or whatever, which is basically they're measuring sugar molecules, glucose molecules attached to the hemoglobin, for those who don't know what that means. And that's happening all over the body. And in
Correct.
biochemistry class that I took, I found this little inlet. It's like this little page inside of a page of the chapter. They weren't talking about it at all, but we had to do a project. So that caught my attention. So I did a project on this whole idea of glucose glomming onto proteins throughout the body. Well, guess what? It's a
It's
big
not
problem.
just hemoglobin. It's
Right.
all
It's
the proteins.
everywhere,
Right.
everywhere. And it
Yep.
has a tendency to go towards epithelial cells, like our blood vessels. Hello, our eyes, the types of cells that are in the eyeballs. Well, what do diabetics have trouble with? They have heart disease, they have trouble with neuropathy, they have trouble with circulation in their feet, they have trouble with their eyes. And so I remember doing that project, and it was just like, okay, right, I got an A on it, but there was no other talk about this. And not long after that, I decided that nutrition wasn't for me, and I decided to pick a different route. So here we are. But let's talk about about this book a little more, and getting into the whole your journey, and weaving into that this whole keto diet and lower carb, just your whole awareness about all of this. And research is flawed in so many ways, but I love how you have research loaded in this book. So for people who are wondering, like, it was great for me, because there were several pages where there'd be the little footnote, and then I'm like, okay, let me go down and read the title of this research study. So for a science geek like me and you, those are fun, and for people who want to look that up. But at the end of the day, we are all so unique, and so your story is unique to you, and what we don't ever talk about in science is the emotional aspect and how that affects our body. And I'm starting to talk about that more and more. So I really, at some point here in this conversation, want to weave in the whole somatic experience and how you have brought up Peter Levine's work, which goes right into what I do in myofascial release and how the stored emotion and just all of the stuff and my experience with cold plunge and how I noticed myofascial unwinding in this shaking and trembling response and how that all feeds together, which is really cool. So tell us a little bit about your story and this whole book idea.
You've noticed some things that are unusual about my book. So you've got Uncommon Testosterone, and that grew out of a bigger book called Uncommon Cold. One of the
Right.
most, you got it, right?
Right.
The most popular aspect of Uncommon Cold were the stories of testosterone. So I thought, okay, I should expand those, I should deepen those, I should enrich those. And I thought it was going to be sort of a little update to the chapter on testosterone and Uncommon Cold. It turned out to be a book of its own. Before Jay Bhattacharya was confirmed as the director of the NIH, he had a copy of my book. He's standing there in front of me, leaping through the pages, and he says, Tom, there are too many scientific footnotes. Nobody is going to read it. You have to condense these. You have to move these. I said, Jay, you're a scientist. I'm a scientist. How can you criticize, the fact that I'm putting 450 scientific citations into my Uncommon Cold book? He said, because it's not going to sell. He's right. These books aren't really written to be bestsellers, at least not in that respect, because it is super important to me to communicate the science and for the reader to understand where they need to go to do their own research, to read it for themselves. I want everything that I'm doing to be based on a rock solid foundation of science. But I also know from a meeting that I had with Alan Alda, who, you remember Alan because we both watched MASH when we were kids. It was like the Seinfeld of its day. The most popular sitcom of all time was MASH, and Alan Alda was the central character. When MASH was done, he did this series on science communication. He would interview scientists and explain scientific principles. And I was lucky enough to do some Alan Alda inspired workshops in improvisational theater, and then to sit down with him for several hours and talk about the essential approach of using theater to communicate science. Alan told me, do your science without emotion. Communicate your science with emotion, because it is stories that impact people, not data. No one has ever been convinced, by a regression analysis. They are convinced by the story behind the regression analysis. That is, the way the regression analysis underlies or explains the story of personal transformation or the emotional arc of what happens to the hero. So I wrote my book in this sort of autobiographical way. It's about me, but I also included other people, case studies or vignettes about other people that corroborate my experience. The testosterone was completely accidental. I started doing ice baths every day because I was scared I was going to die of prostate cancer. I'd gotten this lab report back and it said, okay, elevated PSA. And I spent maybe 20 minutes on WebMD reading about what happens when a man in his 50s gets a PSA report that's too high. Well, you go for a prostate exam, and then you go for a biopsy, and then you go for a prostatectomy. And there seemed to be nothing that would stop this sort of cascade of medical interventions until I wound up with a lifetime of erectile dysfunction. I didn't want that. So instead, I thought, all right, ketosis and ice baths. Prostate-specific antigen is not a diagnosis of cancer. It's associated with a greater risk of cancer, but what it really is a measure of inflammation. What's the best thing you can do for inflammation? Ice bath and keto. That's what I did. And I brought my PSA down without a medical doctor, without a biopsy, without any invasive procedures, without any radiation therapy or anything like that. I went from 7 down to about 1.8, which was free of any risk. What happened along the way was my testosterone zoomed up. I was in the mid 700s for total testosterone, which is really good for, a sedentary college professor in his 50s. There's no doctor in the world who would have said, "Oh, you're looking a little low there, buddy." But after I was doing ice baths every day and then exercising to rewarm, and sometimes it was just walking to class, because I lived about a mile away from campus, just some light exercise to get the circulation going again. My testosterone went up to 1180 nanograms per deciliter. So I added like 400 points to my testosterone accidentally. I needed to figure out what was going on and whether that was a reliable, sort of, could we repeat this in other people, or was I just some weird freak of nature? It turns out, Cindy, that testosterone is manufactured in the mitochondria. And let me clarify. Testosterone has a pretty complicated metabolism. It starts with a steroid called pregnenolone. That is derived from cholesterol, and it happens on the inner mitochondrial membrane where there's an enzyme called P450, if I'm remembering it correctly. So cholesterol has to be transported through the cell membrane, through the outer mitochondrial membrane, and then attach itself to the inner mitochondrial membrane. And that inner mitochondrial membrane is very selective. It has to get through all of these processes. There, it has to meet the P450, where it cleaves off a hydrocarbon chain and converts the cholesterol into pregnenolone. Then it has to be transported again outside the inner mitochondrial membrane, where it can later be converted to testosterone and all the other sex hormones. If your mitochondrial membrane function is not working properly, then you cannot make the steroidal precursors to testosterone. It is no wonder you will have low T if you have a poor metabolism. When you fix the mitochondria, you fix the testosterone. So I had to write this whole book about it. And I included several other people who have experienced the same transformation in their total testosterone that I have. And I've included 3 people who didn't and explained about the reasons why. Even though they did the same protocol, they were either taking medications that interfered with testosterone production, or they'd been on TRT for so long that their testes, in this poor guy's case, had atrophied and they hadn't come all the way back yet, to the point where his Leydig cells are no longer functioning at the level they were even before he went on the TRT. So the testosterone book is filling in the gaps in the conversation about testosterone that nobody is having. Where does testosterone come from? And how do we unlock the ability of the body to heal itself just by giving the right conditions?
Well, and there's more, as I was reading that area about the men who did not have the rise in testosterone, the other stuff that was coming to mind was, what else are they doing that's affecting their mitochondria? There's so many things. I mean, and everything from what they're eating to how much they're sleeping, and are they getting sunlight, and what's their nutrition, so much, right? But we have to look at patterns. I mean, that's what we have to do our best in science. But here's something that was very curious to me. You have a whole section on fertility and just this whole infertility thing, and you bring up women a lot as well. So we're talking a lot about testosterone. I want to really kind of put this home, that this book isn't just for men because it's talking about testosterone, because of course women have testosterone, but then there's a large section in infertility. About 23 years ago, I was specializing in treating women who were having infertility issues with the hands-on myofascial work that I do. And I was also experiencing infertility. For 3 years, I went through all the things that women do. And thankfully, I was living in DC at the time, so I had access to some really good alternative physicians. And what we found was my stress levels were through the roof. My cortisol was all messed up. And what I didn't know now that I know, or didn't know then that I know now, that would have been interesting to follow, is I was also still eating a diet that was largely vegetables and still more carbohydrate. I mean,
Yep.
I had been a vegetarian prior to that for 8 years. So I had all those years of not supporting my body in the way that I should. So this was not too far after that. And I probably still wasn't eating enough protein. And I was still eating way too many carbohydrates and not anywhere near enough fat, which of course we know is a precursor to cholesterol, which is what we need to make our hormones. And so when you were talking about testosterone, I'm remembering back to progesterone because I was very low in progesterone. And that reminded me of something I learned in biochemistry years before that, hello, if your adrenals are shot and you're using all your cortisol up, your body has to steal from Peter to pay Paul, right? So it's if you look at the progesterone pathway, and I won't, you did a great job of explaining all of that in the mitochondria, by the way, but an effort to not lose people here. There are like 3 steps of biochemistry steps that take pregnenolone and bring it to progesterone, right? And there's one little step that can change it to cortisol. And so the body is
Correct.
going to, yeah, it's going to steal the progesterone to give you cortisol because you need it because you're stressed. Because why would you want to reproduce your species if you're so stressed out that you really can't play that role, right? And that made so much sense to me. So through, then what will people do? Supplement with, topical progesterone or all these other things. Well, why not fix the reason why you have that pathway happening anyway, right? So all of this stuff was going through my head as I'm reading this book and thinking of all of the women who are suffering from infertility and what would have happened back then had I known to eat a keto diet and start cold plunging,
What would have happened is you would have conceived a lot faster.
Yeah. Well, I ended up having an IVF, an in vitro
Ugh.
fertilization.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep. Jack
And
Kruse
luckily
has
all
this
that went
great
well.
line. He says, if your body can make it, you don't need to take it.
Yeah.
And I think he's 80% correct. There are some things that your body can't make. Your body can't make magnesium. You
Yeah.
need magnesium.
Right.
But testosterone, progesterone, your body can make.
Mm-hmm.
Vitamin D is something your body can make. There are cases in which you are in acute deficiency, and a patient can be remedied by a supplement to get them through this short-term period. But that's why I say Jack is 80% correct. You need to restore the body's capacity to make what it needs on its own. And sometimes a supplement could be a bridge to that, or an exogenous sort of testosterone or even vitamin D injection could be a bridge to restoring the capacity in the body to do it itself. But administering progesterone, because the body is making too much cholesterol, and I like the way that you described it. They originate in the same pathway. And so they actually compete for one another when you sort of take a fork in those pathways. Should I make this or should I make this? And your body will choose which of these hormones it's going to make based upon the environmental stimulus that it's trying to respond to. When you make more cholesterol, you make less sex hormone because it's the same precursor that from which these two are made. How do you alter that choice so your body says, we should be making progesterone and we should be bringing a child into this world? Of course, managing your stress response is going to help signal your body to restore the fertility that has been interrupted by your constant state of stress. So how would you do that? You don't do it by reporting to your cubicle and burying your feelings about the abuse you're suffering under the corporate world somewhere deep inside of you. Other people might say, well, scream therapy, or, go to talk therapy, or whatever it is. Have a cucumber facial and a mimosa brunch, that'll help you release stress.
Right.
And I really can't argue about any of these things, especially if they help you lead to social connection with other people. But you have a physiological marker of stress dysfunction, and it's chronically high cortisol. You know what helps with that? cold plunge. There's a lot of criticism about cold plunge will burn out your adrenals, but that is not what the data
Yeah.
shows. What it shows is that in a controlled environment, when you activate the sympathetic nervous system, which is what happens when you get into a cold plunge, and you create the norepinephrine, and you create the epinephrine, and you create the dopamine, and you create that cortisol response, your body becomes acclimated to the cold. Cold also strengthens the parasympathetic division of the autonomic nervous system. That's associated with the dive reflex, where your heart rate goes down. Your brain waves collapse into a deeper, meditative, longer wavelength state. And studies of people who do cold plunge over time, that is, their regular practitioners, show that it improves their stress response and normalizes their cortisol levels. If you're chronically too high, cold plunge will bring you down. If you're chronically too low, cold plunge will bring you up. In women, a very similar thing happens to testosterone. The single most important reason, or the dominant reason for infertility in women who are otherwise of childbearing age, is called polycystic ovarian syndrome, PCOS. And this is where cysts form around the ovaries. They impinge upon the ovaries and they cause the ovaries to overproduce testosterone. Now, testosterone is a healthy thing for women. It's the dominant sex hormone in women. There's probably 3-4 times as much testosterone in a healthy woman's bloodstream than there is estradiol. Nobody talks about it, but women need testosterone. They do not need PCOS. And PCOS is metabolic in its origins. When you start cold plunge and you improve your insulin sensitivity and you improve your mitochondrial function, you resolve your PCOS. This allows the ovaries to calm down and do what they're supposed to do instead of what they're not supposed to do when they are impinged upon by these cysts. So cold plunge can bring a woman who's too high in testosterone down and a woman who's too low in testosterone up. That's what I mean by normalizing.
Well, and very possibly the progesterone as well, which we don't know, but it's very likely normalizing all of that is what I suspect, you know?
When you boost your mitochondria, that is, when you stimulate mitobiogenesis in the body, and cold is the best way to make new mitochondria, you improve the pathways of all sex hormone synthesis because they all originate on that inner mitochondrial membrane in pregnenolone. So it's what does your body do with the little bit of pregnenolone that it's making? Well, it could go here, it could go here, it could go here. Or more mitochondria, better mitochondrial function, better functioning of the mitochondrial membranes, and you make more pregnenolone. Now your body has greater resources.
Yes. Can you go back to your statement and explain, because I'm sure you can give more detail on this. Explain why cold plunge is the best way to boost your mitochondria or to help your mitochondria so people understand. I think people are starting to understand a little bit about mitochondria, and at least they know it's important. They've heard the word now. Let's tell them why.
Exercise is good for your mitochondria too. Anything that is a hormetic stressor will cause temporary, we could call it decay or damage or lapse, but a temporary reduction of the body's capacity that stimulates a number of adaptive responses that bring the body back stronger. And so exercise is great. Your muscles get sore, your muscles get weak, but then they come back stronger. That's what we mean by hormetic stress. What's absent from most people's lives is the thermal stress of cold. And people think, well, you know, what do they really need that for? They've got central heat. They've got heated leather seats in their SUV. They've got the tunnel from the parking garage to the building where they work. Like, what the heck would they need cold for? And the answer is brown fat. Although exercise is good for the mitochondria, what it cannot do is stimulate, activate, or recruit brown fat. Only cold can do that. And people might say, what do I need brown fat for? Brown fat is responsible for what's called non-shivering thermogenesis. Everyone has had the experience of being cold and muscle shivering. So here the muscles are sort of spazzing out. They're using glucose, they're burning free fatty acids, and they're doing it to produce heat. But that's not the ideal way to do thermogenesis in the body. For example, infants, they don't have muscles that are mature enough to use shivering thermogenesis, but they have plenty of brown fat. And they use non-shivering thermogenesis. This is where the brown fat generates heat from these sort of metabolic substrates, the free fatty acids and the glucose in the bloodstream. And it keeps the body warm. It used to be that medical doctors thought there was no such thing as brown fat in adult human beings. They used to think, well, it's something that infants and children have, but then we all grow out of it. That is not true. When a human being restores the cold into their stimulus, that is, if they've been getting cold their whole lives, they never lose the brown fat, and they can recruit new brown fat by restoring a cold practice. And you might say, well, that all sounds great. Brown fat is an essential organ. It's not a nice to have so you don't feel chilly, when your husband turns the thermostat down or something like that. I mean, it is nice to have in that regard, but brown fat is in constant communication with the thyroid. They work together to regulate metabolism. Brown fat is a secretory organ, not just an organ for producing heat. So it's associated with these neuroprotective factors like FGF21 or brain-derived neuroprotective factor or RMB3. All of these have acronyms because their organic chemistry names are so long. And what they do is repair brain function, restore brain growth. So without brown fat, it is no wonder that you lapse into metabolic disorder or thyroid disorder or Alzheimer's dementia or any of the other chronic illnesses that are associated with insulin resistance, including type 2 diabetes, stroke, heart disease, obesity. Brown fat protects you against all of those. And the only way to get brown fat is to get cold. So how does that relate to mitobiogenesis? The difference between a white fat cell and a brown fat cell are mitochondria. The reason that it's brown is because it is packed with thousands of these organelles. So these are tiny little, they're almost like separate creatures. They have their own DNA and they exist within your brown fat cells so they can do this job of non-shivering thermogenesis. White fat cells have very little mitochondria, and that's because their function is to store energy. The brown fat, its function is to burn that energy up. That's why it needs mitochondria. So when you get into the cold, you activate your sympathetic division of your autonomic nervous system. You signal your body to shiver and defend against the cold, and you signal it to recruit new brown fat and make new mitochondria. I suspect that it's not just within the cells of the brown fat that mitobiogenesis is taking place. I think it's probably throughout the body. I think that you cannot signal just one thing in the body and say, well, we're just acting on this one area. I think the effect of the cold is systemic. And I'll tell you one of the reasons why. Several people have reported to me an improvement in visual acuity. So they are seeing better after they get out of the cold. And I've experienced this myself, and I thought I was crazy. I'm like, are my eyes really kicking in today? Because, you can probably tell I live, up in this high-rise apartment. There's the hotel behind me. I live in downtown Phoenix, and I can see the mountains. I can see all the way to campus in Tempe. And when I get out of the cold plunge, my vision is so much better. Why would that be, Cindy?
Yeah.
Because the retina is one of the cells in the body that is most dense packed with mitochondria. Vision requires energy. That's what the mitochondria is doing in the retina. They are using glucose to produce the ATP that interprets these wavelengths into signals that your brain interprets. When you get into the cold and you're stimulating your metabolism and you're revving up your mitochondria like that, your vision improves because temporarily because your mitochondria function has also improved. So I think these are systemic improvements in mitochondria throughout the body, not just in the brown fat.
Yeah, I wondered about that because, of course, we talk about where the brown fat is. And then, my question is always, well, how is that helping the whole body? But like you said, it's a secretory organ. So it's chemicals out to our body. And I just feel like there's so much we don't fully understand about that. I remember when I first started doing cold plunging and was kind of, learning about herd brown fat, I started, researching that a little bit. And of course, what do I find within like the first 5 things that I'm researching is that it is an article where they're talking about trying to make a medication to give people that would increase their brown fat. Like, really?
Yep.
It's
Brown
not.
fat is the target for metabolic therapy. So,
Okay.
obesity is a metabolic disorder. Insulin resistance is a metabolic disorder. And it makes a lot of sense because brown fat is associated with better body composition and increased insulin sensitivity. It can bring insulin levels down. It makes sense to target brown fat. But of course, in their pharmaceutical research labs, they're trying to target it with a pill instead of a machine or a lake or a pond or an ocean or any of the other ways that you can get cold. Now, I happen to live in the hottest city in North America. So I can't even take a cold shower in Phoenix. The tap water just isn't cold enough. I had to build a machine. It's right over my shoulder. It's out on my
Yep.
balcony. This is my Morozko ice bath. For me to get the cold that my body is expecting, I need that machine. So now we call Morozko the next best thing to nature. Morozko is not the best way to do cold exposure. It's kind of like Avis. We're number 2. The best way to do cold exposure is to cut a hole in the ice, jump into Lake Erie, or jump into the Pacific Ocean, or
Yeah.
get it, or roll in the snow.
Mm-hmm.
But the next best thing is a Morozko. And if I don't have any snow, then Morozko is the best I can do.
Yeah. Well, and I would like to have you point out why a little bit more about why that is, especially the grounding effects and the ozone. So talk about that a little bit because I've been lucky enough to be able to have my pond, which just this week now is too warm to do anything. So I'm kind of into, getting out the ice buckets. But talk about that a little bit and how that is helps to make it more like my pond, right? When I'm breaking ice.
Human beings are aquatic. Our ancient ancestors, they lived at the water's edge. They had to, because during the ice age, even East Africa, where the oldest human fossils are found, even East Africa was covered with glaciers. There are 4 active glaciers on the mountaintops of East Africa right now. Where does Wim Hof bring his trainees? They climb up
Yeah.
Mount, what is it, Kilimanjaro or something. They go to
Yeah.
the equator to get cold. So it's ironic. But during the ice age, you couldn't harvest, you couldn't hunt. There was no such thing as summer. Mount, whatever it is, Pinatumo, I don't know exactly, but maybe it's 70,000 years ago, and a massive volcanic eruption coats the atmosphere with ash. What do your ancient ancestors do? They eke out a living at the water's edge. They forage in the water. They fish in the water. They give birth in the water. We are meant to be aquatic. And that's why we have these anatomical features like downward facing nostrils, so we can dive in without the water going right up into our brain. Other primates with whom we share 99% of our DNA, they don't have nostrils like we have. They don't have the subcutaneous fat that we have. That's the fat just below the skin. Dolphins have that. Whales have that. We have anatomical features that are more in common with the aquatic mammals than with the land-based mammals. So we are meant to be aquatic and we are meant to get cold. When you take the human being out of the environment that they are evolved for, that they are optimized for, is it any wonder that the human being gets sick? Of course not, because they're not getting the stimulus that they need from the environment to keep themselves healthy. And so they say, well, you need surgery, or well, you need a drug, or you don't have a vitamin C supplement deficiency. You have a sunlight deficiency, as an example. You don't have a pharmaceutical deficiency that targets your brown fat. You have a cold deficiency. You give your body the things that it's expecting from the environment, and your body knows what to do with it and heal. Our ancestors, when they got into the water, they might have been, by the river.
Hmm.
They were likely by the ocean. What was happening for them? They got the salt from the ocean, for example. They were in constant contact with the electrons available from the earth. They didn't have Air Jordans. They didn't have synthetic materials that would disconnect them from the earth.
Hmm.
And they needed that salt. Your body needs salt. You can't exist, in the middle of the Sahara sweating out to maintain homeostatic temperatures without replenishing the salt that you lose along the way.
Hmm.
So we did several things with the Morozko to try and replicate the idea of the cold ocean. One of those things is it's grounded. When you get in, even here, me on the 32nd floor, when I get into my Morozko, I am in instantaneous contact, electrical contact with the earth. You might have seen some of the posts that we've done on zeta potential. When the red blood cells build up a charge, they tend to agglomerate. Zeta potential is the charge cloud around a particle that is suspended in water. And when you compress the zeta potential and the red blood cells get closer together because they don't have that electric cloud around them, then they can agglomerate. And that's why the blood viscosity increases when you're not grounded. Then you become
Hmm.
grounded. You get the electrons from the earth. It alters the zeta potential, allows them to disaggregate and flow more freely through your blood vessels. It's the way your body was meant to be.
Hmm.
The salt is the same thing. You can put as much Epsom salt into your Morozko as you want. You can see I got like a bag of it sitting right here. That's like an
Yeah.
18-pound bag. I put like 9 pounds in already. I could put the whole bag in if I wanted. The Morozko's warranted for it. It's built for it. It's not a problem. Do not put chloride salts in there, but the
Hmm.
magnesium sulfate salts are fine. And the reason you don't put the chloride in is because we use ozone to disinfect the water. You can imagine for, aesthetic reasons like clarity or odor, you want the water to be clean. But for health reasons, you want the water to be clean. And
Yeah.
the most powerful aquatic disinfectant is ozone. It will deactivate the Ebola virus in a matter of seconds. So we
Mhm.
wanted to use ozone because ozone occurs naturally. It's sometimes called the smell of lightning. When a
Yes.
spark strikes through the atmosphere, it will convert some of the O2 in the atmosphere into ozone. It has a distinct smell, and your nose is very sensitive to that smell. Your nose is a brilliant ozone detector. So you begin to smell it long before you reach the OSHA or EPA exposure limits. It
Hmm.
keeps the water clean, and it's also good for your skin, and it's a natural disinfectant. I don't want chlorine anywhere near my customers because chlorine, like they put in swimming pools, is an unnatural disinfectant and it leads to cancer causing agents. It's not healthy. So
Hmm.
those are the three things we were talking about: the grounding, the salt, and why the ozone for the ice bath. And it's to replicate what happens in nature and give your body the stimulus that your ancestors enjoyed. But because we have such modern technological lives, we are disconnected from.
Absolutely. So I wanted to ask you again, back when you talked about your testosterone and finding out your PSA levels, you did a search, you found out about the keto diet and the inflammation. So I found that interesting. I didn't know that before. Like that was what brought you to the cold. Before that, you had no thought of
Oh
doing.
no, it was a lot of fun. I mean, I started cold showers because
Okay.
I was en route to a divorce. I was separated from my wife. The kids were almost all grown up. I got to figure out dating again. I knew that I had made myself fat and unattractive. So I started losing weight and I was reading every self help book that I could find.
Hmm.
And one of those books said, "Hey, dude, you should take cold showers. It'll toughen you up." All right, I want to be tough, right? So I'm going to get in. And this is probably 65 degrees. Like by the standards that I would apply now,
Yeah.
not even cold. And I
Right.
hated every minute of every cold shower that I ever took.
Yeah.
But then a former student of mine said, "Well, have you ever done an ice bath?" I'd never done an ice bath. "Have you ever heard of Wim Hof?" I'd never heard of Wim Hof. So he invited me to do this kind of like Burning Man group thing with the breathing and the cold plunge. I loved the ice bath. I got in there and I felt, instead of anger, like in the cold shower, I felt
Mhm.
a state of calm. So I'm like, hey, this is really cool. We should get together. We should do this again. So we started doing it like every other weekend. We'd buy a bunch of ice. We'd get into the ice bath.
Mhm.
By the time I got my PSA, I'm like, no, I got to do this all the time. I bought an old, new actually freezer, like when Sears was a thing and they used to
Yeah.
sell appliances. That's
Sure.
how long ago this is. I bought myself a Kenmore chest freezer. So like there was no such
Okay.
thing as Morozko. There were no ice baths on the market. And I did this every day. It worked so good that we had to invent one because we didn't
Mhm.
want to drive, to the quickie mart and get 100 pounds of ice just to watch it melt at 115 degrees in the backyard in Phoenix.
Right.
We wanted a machine so that we could get into the ice bath anytime we wanted, even if it was just for a couple of minutes. So we built one. And then, we put it up on Etsy of all places. And some people found it and they said that they wanted to buy it. Well,
Wow.
that was the genesis of Morozko. I thought we might be lucky to sell one or two ice baths, that we build in the backyard like a week.
Yeah.
But what's happened since, I guess we sold our first one 2019. And what's happened since then is Joe Rogan became a customer, Cam Hanes became a customer, Brent Greenfield became a customer, and ice baths just taken off. I
Yeah.
just saw, I'm in this Twitter group of direct messaging, and somebody said that they went to Walmart and got they called it an ice bath that was branded by Sharper Image for $60. And didn't they do a good job? And I didn't know what to tell them. I guess that's okay. My ice baths, they cost $10,000 and up. So
Yeah.
what's the difference? Well, first of all, we make ice. That doesn't happen in that plastic inflatable thing that you just bought from Costco or from Home Depot or whatever. You don't get the grounding. And when you open it up and it smells like plastic, you are climbing into a soup full of brominated flame retardants and bisphenol A and phthalates and all the other things that go with that. But you got to start somewhere. I started with a
Yeah.
freezer, and other people
Mhm.
are going to start with a plastic tub or a horse trough or something like that.
Yep. That's what I got right now.
There you
But
go.
I'm working on it. I'm going to get myself a Morozko one day for sure. But so that's really interesting. So that was in 19 when you first sold your first forge out of Etsy, right? And then so when did you do the first ice bath ever when you found out about Wim Hof? I
Oh,
love timing, so I'm trying to figure out. It's kind of fun because this is also, it's absolutely exploded since I started this 3 years ago. It
must have
just
been
kind
2018
of,
when
okay.
I did my first ice bath with ice in it.
Okay. So in 22, well, back in 2000, I took a Tony Robbins, I don't
Maybe
know,
it was 2017, Cindy. It's
17,
hard to
maybe?
put a year on it,
Yeah.
and I'm trying to remember this timeline. And it
Well,
came before I got my PSA results back. I must have done my first ice bath in 2017.
okay.
Yeah.
So
Sorry, go ahead.
you had been doing it for a while before you got your PSA, which means
As a
maybe that's,
hobby. Yeah.
yeah, so maybe that's why your testosterone was already good. Because remember we talked about that. You said it wasn't bad anyway, right? But a lot of men nowadays are very low in their testosterone in their 40s and even in their
Right.
30s and younger, as you
Yep.
mentioned.
It's
It's
terrible.
yeah, it's really bad. So it was in 2000 I heard about Tony Robbins jumping in this ice, or not, it wasn't ice bath, into cold water every morning, and I remember the number was 59 degrees,
Yep.
and it
Tony
freaked.
Robbins. I've never met him. I've never talked to him. He talks about cold plunge some in
Yeah,
one of his most recent books. And I'm like, God dang it, Tony. You are walking on burning coals,
I
but you
know.
won't get into an ice bath. And I'm not
Well,
walking on any burning coals until I see Tony up to his neck,
okay. Like a
in
nice.
chunks of ice. I'm like, forget it. So
Well,
59
he
degrees.
probably would, he probably would, but this was 25 years ago. Nobody was talking about
Well,
this
have
stuff.
him call me.
Okay, well, I
Yeah.
don't know, but we'll see if we get that happen. That would be great. So, but I remember thinking, no way would I ever do that in 59 degrees, you know, because I hated cold water my whole life. I was the last kid to get in our backyard pool, you know, and I'm started swimming in my 20s and doing triathlons, and that was the worst part of it, was getting in the darn cold water. I mean, it was awful. Well, in 22, so 3 years ago, I was going through a lot of emotional stuff. I just had a divorce, and I was in a lot of emotional pain. And so I thought, I don't know, it was always in my mind, this cold thing. And then I was introduced to Instagram and started looking around Instagram, and I always am putting in scientific searches and stuff. And something came up. I think it was Susanna Soberg's stuff. And I'm like, I should just do this, because it was March and here we are in Michigan, and the ice had just melted off of my pond, and I was really quite low, emotionally. And I just decided, oh, I'm just going to do this. It was the first day of spring. And it was like, I don't remember the exact outdoor temperature, but the water temperature was like 44 degrees or something. And I decided I was going to do 2 minutes and see if I could do it, And I was in there, and I can, the whole gasping. I didn't have any instruction, by the way. What's out there now is amazing, which I'd love for you to kind of go over that briefly. And I've helped a lot of people just in their bathtub, like, get to this point. And I remember at one point during those 2 minutes thinking, this hurts like hell, but it doesn't, and it was weird. Like, this burns, like, it hurts, like, that's really odd, but it doesn't hurt at all the way my heart hurts right now.
Right.
It doesn't hurt like I have hurt in my life, and I was bringing up emotion because it was that powerful for me.
Yep.
And in those next few days, when I had to really talk myself into doing, because I had made a promise to myself that I was going to do at least 11 minutes in that next week. And one day I was sitting there in the water while I'm standing there, up to here, and thinking about what are some things that were worse in my life, knowing that this was going to be good for me. That was the thing. I knew that there were good benefits out of this, and I'm all about essential therapies. And I thought this could be great for my immune system. And that's really what I was going for, was the physiological thing. I had no idea about any kind of emotional or mental health things at all. And I at one point, it was a colder day than the first day. It's funny how the pond can change temperature really quick. It's weird. And I remember thinking, what is the most painful thing that I ever experienced at that point? And it was being next to my grandmother when she took her last breaths, and it brought me back to that. And I'm like, yeah, this is nothing. This is nothing compared to that, and I can do this, and it allowed me to, I believe at that point, go through some somatic release of the loss and the emotional pain of losing my grandmother, who I was very close to. And since then, multiple times now in the water, I've experienced this. And I'm drawn to the chapter in your first book, The Uncommon Cold, and then also in some posts that you've made talking about this, and Dr. Peter Levine's work, which John Barnes, my mentor for myofascial release, had brought up Peter Levine many years ago in Waking the Tiger, and how through release of restricted and stuck fascia in the body, we're actually, I believe, releasing stuck energy of trauma, which can create this unwinding effect that we call it myofascial unwinding, allowing the body to go maybe into movement of past trauma, positions of past trauma, but then also this thawing response that happens. So we're all familiar with fight, flight, freeze. Then there's the thaw. And you've talked about that, this whole like shaking, trembling thing, and how this can release. And Peter Levine talks about, he was in an accident, right? And his body went into this trembling, and he allowed that to happen. And the whole idea that if we don't allow this physiological response to happen as we are processing trauma and able to actually let that energy go, we'll just, for lack of a better word, then it can cause problems in the body. And I believe that's what I'm helping people with. when I'm doing hands-on treatment and finding these areas in their body, because our bodies are a manifestation of our emotional body as well, and how we hold on to things. So I would love to get your perspective and thoughts on this, because clearly you've researched some of this and you're familiar with Peter Levine and this whole emotional thing. What I experienced that first week for me in my cold pond, when I realized emotional pain is harder than this, using the cold to help me through that has been profound since then. And I've had multiple things happen in these last 3 years where I have strength now, and we use the word resilience a lot. Emotional resilience, I think it's added to my emotional intelligence, my ability to manage stress, because I have practiced, I have strengthened that muscle and allowed myself to let go of that holding pattern. So what do you have to add to that or share?
Everyone I know would choose physical pain over heartbreak any day.
Amen.
There is nothing that hurts worse than betrayal or shame. So I'm reading a book that Marsha Linehan wrote. She invented DBT, dialectic behavioral therapy.
Okay.
And what she didn't admit at the beginning of her career is that she invented it because she was trying to heal herself. In her book, she talks about what happened to her as a teenager when she was admitted to a mental institution and the deterioration of her mental health. She became a cutter, which is really hard to understand. Like, why would someone intentionally hurt themselves? She said that she used to break out panes of glass at the institution and cut her skin, and she would get relief from the emotional pain in the physical pain. So one of the things she said in the book was that the endorphin release, would help her deal with the pain. But you've said something else. I think that this idea that the physical pain is nothing compared to the emotional pain.
Yeah.
It, it makes sense to me that when we put ourselves into the cold and it hurts in our toes, or it hurts in our fingers, it does stimulate the neurotransmitters and the hormones and everything of the sympathetic activation, including the cortisol. It stimulates the productions of all these things that help the body cope with pain. The pain in this case is not physical, the pain is emotional. But the physiological response to this cold stimulus probably helps us through it.
Yeah.
Then you get out, and at least for
Yeah.
me, I feel like Superman. I feel like I can do anything. Nobody can bother me or touch me or hurt me anymore. And
Yeah.
so I wonder if there's an analogy in Marsha Linehan's account of how she discovered some comfort in cutting and the challenge, the pain of getting into the ice bath. I wouldn't be surprised if there was, but I'm
Yeah.
not expert enough and I haven't finished her book to figure out what that is. What I have studied is the somatic holding of trauma. That is, trauma is not stress. Trauma is unresolved stress. Our bodies are prepared to deal with stress. Our nervous system knows what to do. Our muscles know what to do. Our brain knows what to do when we're stressed. When we're not allowed to do those things, this is when stress becomes trauma. So Levine cites studies. These are often in children, for example. Maybe they have to be anesthetized for a dental procedure, or heaven forbid, there's a brain surgery, something like that. What he discovered is that the children who are immobilized during the trauma are the ones who suffer PTSD. Stress gets held in the body when it cannot be released through the fighting or through the running, or when it cannot be released through the action of the body. If you fight back or escape, then you do not suffer the same long-standing consequences of the trauma. What is that good book? I can't remember, but it's about sort of trusting your gut. And it studied people who were victims of violence. And they discovered that those people who resisted, they suffered the violence, and maybe the violence was even worse, but the emotional trauma of the event was less because they emerged feeling like they were more proud of themselves, feeling like they were more active, like they had made choices to advocate for themselves. So Levine says trembling, he doesn't call it shivering, but trembling is one of those activities in the body that will release the stress, resolve the stress so that it doesn't be held as trauma. And of course, we know that the cold plunge will initiate shivering. Even though I got plenty of brown fat, there are some days that I get into that cold plunge and I start shivering like 15 seconds and I know what's going on. I'm anxious or I'm upset or I'm scared or I'm lonely or I'm having one of these negative emotions that human beings carry with them that makes it difficult to be alive.
Mhm.
And then I shiver and I say, bring it. Let's shiver like crazy today. I want all that shivering so that the cold water can take those negative emotions away. And then I come out and I got 3 new ideas about stuff I haven't tried, or I got the energy now to get after whatever it is that is on my list that might hopefully make my life better. You know, the cold plunge has some kind of therapeutic psychological effect when you get in at temperatures that frighten you. Not just that, make you feel cold, but make you feel scared. Then you overcome it and you feel like you've managed some stressful event from a position of control, which is one of the ways that Peter Levine writes that we can resolve trauma. It's the same thing in a book by Leonard Cohen called Playful Parenting. When a child experiences a traumatic event, maybe they go for their well child visit, and heaven forbid their pediatrician gives them a shot. And the pediatrician says, "Oh, it's just going to feel like a little pinch," but it doesn't. It feels worse than that. And their arm is sore and they feel lied to and betrayed. What do they want to do when they get home? They want to get their dolly and they want to pay doctor's office. But the child is not the patient. The dolly is the patient. The child will always adopt the position of control and relive the traumatic event from that position as a way of feeling like they have psychological control over the event and resolving the trauma. Bessel van der Kolk writes about this in the last chapter of his book, The Body Keeps the Score. He talks about all these different psychedelics and EMDR therapy and ketamine and things that you can do to try and resolve trauma. And at the very last chapter, he almost apologizes for how speculative it is. He talks about improv theater. You
Okay.
can recreate the events of the trauma. Your brain does not know the difference between what you're imagining and what is actually happening. At least if your brain does know, the cells in your body don't. And so you can use improv theater to position a patient within the events of their trauma that they get to relive in control. So you position them in control of the situation and resolve it. Peter Levine talks about this. Bessel van der Kolk talks about this, and we see it play out in our relationships all the time. We pick people that activate in us, that remind us of our unresolved traumas. So a parent who's narcissistic, and then you just somehow choose narcissistic partners because something in your unresolved childhood trauma is saying, if I could only find this person and then relive the traumatic experience of my childhood from a position of control in this relationship, convince them to love me the way my parent really should have loved me, then I would be healed. And of course, in relationships, it doesn't work that way. It just devolves into pointless power struggles of people trying to control the other person because they're like, no, I want my trauma resolved. No, I want my trauma resolved first. And most of them have no idea what those traumatic experiences were or why they chose those people. Isn't it much better to just get in the ice bath, and work it out without them,
Right.
without having to
Um,
control other people?
I 100% agree. And you know, when I'm thinking back to when I first started, I mean, I don't know how long it was. I so wish I would have taken notes and journaled and all that, but my life was not in any way that I could do. I was lucky to get in the pond, right? So I just have to go from memory. But I don't know how far it was that I was doing it. Not long, like maybe in the first month. And I noticed that I felt this, it was almost like a solid line where all of a sudden I crossed that line and I felt better. And so I started really watching my watch and seeing exactly when that happened. And on the fourth day, when I felt that breath and I felt that relief, and I noticed it was either 28 seconds or 30 seconds on the fourth time. I'm like, oh my gosh, what is that? So then I go research that. I'm like, oh, well, that's when everything, it takes 30 seconds for everything to get released into your bloodstream. And like clockwork after that, it was like, okay, I can get through this, you know? So then I started taking events from my past, or maybe that I was going through then, and going into the cold and breathing into that and really connecting into my heart center, which is what I teach my patients to do with myofascial release, and just really being able to release the stress or whatever in your body, right? And that's when it started to really shift me. It took me longer, I think, to get to that point, because that was really a crazy time for me. But over the next several months and through the summer, and I'm putting my ice cubes in my ice bath, and I feel like in the 40s, you know, sometimes maybe
Good.
low 40s, which was good, you know. And I was increasing the amount of time, because until you kind of get used to what you're doing, you're like, oh, I'm just going to do more, you know. So you play around with that for a while, but it really became like leveling up meditation, I would say. And I'm not great about sitting there for, you know, many. I've had periods of my life where I've done that, but a lot of my meditation time is other self-treatment that I'm doing. So it became that for me on a different level. And I just find it really interesting to be able to just contemplate. And I don't think there's any way you can research it, right? But maybe ask other people their experiences, what it does for people. Can we heal these things even better with a focused attention, using the ideas from The Body Keeps the Score, from Levine's work, from even myofascial work, from the stress management space? And when you emerge from that water, because I'm the same way, and that's what really kept me going, was, you know, several weeks after I started, after this divorce, then my dad passed away unexpectedly. And I just knew, well, because there was a lot of pain, right? I was like, I'm going to go and have this pain instead of this other pain. I'm
Yep.
going to have this physical pain instead of this emotional pain. And then one thing after another, throughout that whole year kept happening. That was putting me in that space of emotional pain and fear and almost losing my mom and all these things. And then I stopped doing the ice, or getting in my pond and getting in my little pot or whatever, because my mom was going through emergency surgery, heart surgery, and was 2 weeks long. I mean, all this stuff. So I quit. And it was in December, so 2 months later of not doing ice or getting in the cold. And I was really getting depressed. Now, here's the bizarre part. I had, you know, been in a good place about the whole divorce and even my dad's situation. My mom had gotten through her situation. I knew she was going to be okay. Like I almost lost her, you know, and I was on the good side. I was on the other side of that hill, and I couldn't figure out why I was getting depressed. Like, this is weird. And then it hit me. It's the pond, you know, because after my dad had died, and I realized, I wonder if I should feel worse than I am right now. And I looked it up, and I wonder if there's anything on ice bath and depression. Oh my gosh, you know, and this was
There's
3
a
years
ton
ago.
of stuff.
There's
Yep.
a ton more, right? And
Yep.
so that really kept me going. And then it wasn't 2 weeks after I got back into, by then it was ice. In fact, I couldn't get into my pond because the ice was, you know, 5 inches thick, and it took a little bit before me to get in there. And it took maybe a week, and I started feeling relief. But it's after every plunge you feel that relief,
Yep.
you know? So I would hang on to that and hang on to that and hang on to that. And really, you know, what started out is just, oh, I'll give this a try for a week, has turned into really one of my top essential therapies. And I still don't like doing it, I'll be honest. You
Nobody
know?
likes doing it.
nobody, it's still like you have to, get yourself psyched up to do. But I can't not do it. I mean, I'll go a few days and not get in there. And so now I have to like rethink, okay, now we're shifting to the warmer weather and you have to kind of do it differently. So I won't get in every day. But because it takes a lot of time to do to get that all prepared, but
Yep.
so nice to be able to just pop in there. So yeah, that whole somatic thing I think is important. And when that first, there was an Instagram post, I'm wondering if you can maybe remember this one that Morozko put up. It was a man getting into the plunge and he was really trying to get through it. You guys had it pinned for a long time.
That was
And
Patrick Porter, the
okay,
founder
yeah.
of Brain Tap. Yep.
Really?
hmm
Tell me about that.
Well, when Patrick was in high school and college, he was an athlete. By the time he'd finished his doctorate, he'd given up doing ice baths because that was just stuff he did for football, you know?
Yeah.
So decades later, Patrick has founded several companies. He's a serial entrepreneur. He's written several books, and he's all about the brain and mental health and meditation. He hadn't done an ice bath since he was a football player. So he came
Mhm.
to Phoenix and he went to Reconnect in Mesa with Jeremy Mudick. Jeremy Mudick was the very first Morozko customer ever, the guy who bought that one in January 2019. It wasn't off of Etsy. We advertised on Etsy where people found it, but we never sold anything through Etsy. Jeremy
Okay.
came to us because I can't remember, maybe it was through word of mouth, because we had a party to celebrate the fact that we'd invented an ice bath. And Jeremy coached Patrick Porter through his first ice bath. And Patrick, I just saw him in Dallas at CryoCon. He followed me on the main stage and he said, every time I see Dr. Seager, I have like a little emotional flashback to my first ice bath. I cried like a baby. But you
Yeah.
can see him. He's exaggerating. That you
Yeah.
can see him in that video regain control of his body and his
Mhm.
breath and his feelings. And
Mhm.
so it's a very vulnerable video, and I'm so glad that he allowed us to post it.
Yeah.
But it's like a hero's journey. That was
Yeah.
Patrick leaving the familiar world and going into the scary, unfamiliar world of the cold and conquering that so that when he
Mhm.
comes back, he is a better person.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, that video was really key for me. It helped me a lot through that difficult time because every day I would have to, I mean, I'm trying to get myself in this pond, and until I really got this whole pain thing down and the emotional piece and I'd play my, Rocky theme music and I'd pull up Morozko and I'd look at you talking in that in your ice bath or somebody, and that particular one I mean, I had tears watching it the first time. I watched it multiple times because that was when I really felt that connection of what I was going through. And here it's not just me, here's someone else. Yes, there's something deeper going on
Yep.
here, which I really want to shout about right now because in the last several months and especially recently, there's been all this talk and this kind of like, oh well, and I've gotten lots of text messages and just concern from people. Oh, should you really be doing that? Look at this. Women shouldn't be doing this, and on and on. And aren't you doing too much of this? And it's frustrating for me because this has changed my life. And I can absolutely say my pond was 56 degrees yesterday. It didn't do anything for me. I mean, I could have just, I guess, swam laps in it and it would have gotten more time, but I didn't really have time for that. And so what I think is being not talked about enough is this whole resiliency thing and how it can help you through this emotional space and let go of things that are no longer serving you and create something that maybe we don't even know how to define. And somehow it's a piece of this, what have we done in our modern world where we have made ourselves so comfortable that we don't even know what we don't know. We don't even know what we're doing to ourselves. This is so powerful to me that it really it's heartbreaking when I have people say, well, you shouldn't be doing this and shouldn't be doing. I think you've done a great job, by the way, of kind of explaining and having people on about this whole thing about the concern of women and doing cold exposure. And it all comes down to adaptation. I mean, I don't understand why there's this big talk about it. We are all unique, and if you want to have your body adapt, you can, just like you mentioned the ice age, right? So I just wanted to leave it open for you to, if there's anything else you'd like to say about that, about women and cold plunging and temperatures, and especially as we've been talking about hormones, because I wish I could have done this when I was having those hormone problems.
If you don't want to do a cold plunge, you
Don't do
don't
it.
need Stacy Sims to go on Instagram and tell you not to do it. When you
Absolutely.
look at those posts, she was on Diary of a CEO. She was on Andrew Huberman. She was on Mel Robbins. And it was the Mel Robbins one that really pushed us
Mhm.
over the edge. You
Yeah.
look at that post, and the headlines misinterpret what Stacy Sims actually says. They say, why ice baths are bad for women. And that's not what she says at all. But
Mm-mm.
Stacy allows those headlines to misrepresent what she actually said because they get a lot of clicks. When you look at the comments, half the comments are from women saying, what the heck is this? Ice baths have helped save my life. Ice baths have changed
Mhm.
everything for the better for me. I don't understand why anybody would be criticizing. And the other half of the comments are, I knew I shouldn't do ice baths. I've never done one and I never will. And now I know why.
Mhm. Yeah.
Well, who are you going to believe? The people who have done it and said it's great, or the people who have never done it and are looking for an excuse
Mhm.
not to do it and found one? The fact
Mhm.
is, ice baths are hard. A lot of things are hard. Mastin Kipp is the first person to quote to to put this quote in my head. I think he said, "Everything you want is on the other side of fear." I think he was quoting
Mhm.
George Adair or somebody else. I can't remember exactly right. Maston reworded it. He might have said, fear is a compass that points you in the direction of your dreams. And
Mhm.
most people don't want to go into that fear. It's
Mhm.
okay. Stay on the couch. Don't do the hard thing. Just because all these super successful people who have transformed their lives, gone from dirt, from nothing to like accomplished, doesn't mean you have to do it.
Mm-mm.
Go out and get drunk with your friends instead and see what Stacy Sims says about that. The
Yeah.
cold plunge is hard. And on the other side of hard, that's where your dreams start coming true.
Yeah. Absolutely.
What's
And I
that
cannot.
Marianne Williamson quote? Do you remember her?
Yeah. Um, don't know the
I
quote
think
though.
she was running for president or something on the libertarian ticket. But long before then, she had this great quote about fear. Do you remember it?
I don't remember it.
I think I'm looking it up right here.
Okay.
Our deepest fear is not that we are inadequate.
Oh yeah.
Our deepest fear is that we are powerful beyond measure. It is our light, not our darkness, that most frightens us. We ask ourselves, who am I to be brilliant, gorgeous, talented, and fabulous? Actually, who are you not to be? You are a child of God. Your playing small does not serve the world. There is nothing enlightened about shrinking so that other people won't feel insecure around you. We were born to make manifest the glory of God that is within us. It's not just in some of us, it's in everyone. As we let our own light shine, we unconsciously give other people permission to do the same. As we are liberated from our own fear, our presence automatically liberates others. So it's the first two lines there. It is our deepest fear is not that we are inadequate. Our deepest fear is that we are powerful beyond measure. What might we discover about ourselves if we get into that cold water? We might discover that we can do things that people in our lives told us not to even attempt. And you know
Mhm.
why that's so damn scary? When we discover how powerful we are, then there's no one to blame but us.
Yeah.
My God, it's so much more comfortable to say, this is Trump's fault. This is Kennedy's fault. This is Biden's fault. This is Harris's fault. This is Fauci's fault.
Mhm.
It's so comfort to feel that satisfaction of moral superiority that says it's not your fault. And then you get into the ice bath and you realize this deepest fear that you're powerful beyond measure. Whose fault is it now?
Mhm. Yeah. That's why when I'm in there, one of my, especially in the beginning, is I can do hard things. I would say it over and over. I can do hard things. I can do hard things. Along with, this doesn't hurt as bad as, or whatever. And by the time you get that flood of chemicals that is serving you, and you get out of the water and stand there with my powerful pose, and I'm looking out at that hay field, like, I can handle today, and I can't
Yep.
tell you how many times something will come up during my day and I'm like, oh, I got in that cold water this morning. I can do anything. If I can do that, I can handle this. And it just keeps on giving, and over and over. And even when I was in a bad bike accident 2 years ago, I had been doing this practice for a year, and I crashed my face into the ground. My whole cranial bone here was pushed so that my right front tooth was right behind my left front tooth. And of course, I used what I know from myofascial release and other calming things that I do. But I don't believe I would have been able to stay as calm as I needed to had I not been practiced in the ice. When that happened, I'm like, oh, this is what it
Mm.
feels like. Like, instead of this is what cold feels like, I'm like, this is what it feels like when you crash your face in the ground. Oh, this is what it feels like when you mess your teeth and your mouth up. Okay, what can I do now? I'm in control. I was in control of that situation from the moment I came to, because I immediately went to what I had been practicing. And I think that gets lost in a lot of what's out there today. Is the whole point of doing this is, for me now, not just all the physiological things that are happening with the brown fat and all that and the vascularity and whatever, is that I am making a choice to do this, and it's changing how I look at everything in my
Correct.
world, and how I manage stress. And now, if I can manage stress in this environment, how does that move forward with everything else? And because I was able to stay calm that day, I was able to literally move my cranial bone back where it was supposed to go. And I mean, I just think that gets lost. And I just want to thank you from the bottom of my heart for all that you do for this whole topic. And all that's out there and all the criticism that comes and goes, and it's still, the facts are, it's that N=1, and that you've been talking about this whole time. And that helped me so much. And I hope that other people will consider, if they've made it this far into this talk, that if they haven't considered this yet, it's not difficult. And just the real easy way of starting it is in the bathtub, right? Feet first, pay attention to your breath, calm yourself. And
I don't know if it's easy, but it's not
yeah,
complicated.
it's not complicated, right?
Yeah.
Simple, not easy, right? So,
Right. Yep.
um, anything else that you tell people if they don't have a Morozko, they don't have a chance to go visit you, they have a bathtub? What do you
Run the
say?
tap water. In the wintertime, it'll be cold.
Yeah,
Buy the bags of ice, pour it into your bathtub. You
yeah,
can make it.
yep.
Yep.
Amazing. Anything
Thank you,
else you want
Cindy.
to add?
No. Uh, this has been a wonderful time to spend together. Thank
Yeah,
you for reading my books and for asking me questions about the things that you've read.
you're welcome. I have more if you ever want to take the time.
I'm,
I,
I'm, I'm on Instagram. I'm on Twitter. You
okay.
know where to find me.
Yes, and we will put in there where to find you. And I look forward to Uncommon. What's the next one?
It's hard to know. I want to do a book on uncommon cancer
Yeah,
because cancer is metabolic in its origins, and we know how to fix it.
yeah,
But something happened yesterday. Kennedy has said we're going to know what causes autism by September or whatever. And he must have fired up the NIH, and he's probably got the Doge guys and the data crunchers and whatever. But he says we're going to look at everything. It's fine. what happened was Chris Palmer from Harvard put out a tweet. It was a review paper in Nature about the mitochondrial dysfunction and its association with autism. I'm like, okay, that's really interesting. So I
Yeah.
started looking at it. Cindy, I now know what causes autism. It's not the vaccine. Autism is caused by mitochondrial dysfunction at the critical stages of brain development. So that's late in the pregnancy and early in infancy. This would be last trimester, first year of life, when the brain is growing its fastest. When the mitochondria are defective, they do not produce the right patterns of brain development. They prime the brain for autism, but the autism doesn't appear until it gets an immunological trigger. That could be a vaccine, but it could also be a fever or an infection or something like this. And the reason that I know this is because it's analogous to type 1 diabetes. Now, there's a lot of literature on mitochondrial dysfunction and autism. I'm not making this up. The literature is really good, and it shows a strong association between blood markers of mitochondrial dysfunction and autism. About 80% in one study of children aged 2 to 5 showed these blood markers of metabolic dysfunction resulting from mitochondrial injury, and they all had autism. So you could say, what about the other 20% that didn't have those blood markers of mitochondrial dysfunction? And my experience with type 1 diabetes explained it. There was a longitudinal study in Finland. They tracked this for decades, infants who grew up to be children, who grew up to be adults. And they noticed that vitamin D insufficiency late in pregnancy or the first year of life was associated with an increased risk of the onset of type 1 diabetes later in life, even if normal levels of vitamin D were restored in childhood or early adulthood. That was insufficient to protect the child who had less vitamin D during late stage pregnancy, first year of life. You could restore vitamin D later, but the immune system is developing so fast. The critical stage of development of the immune system is in the first year of life. And if the body doesn't have enough vitamin D during that first year, it will be primed for type 1 diabetes. And what triggers the onset of type 1 diabetes? An immunological event like a viral infection or the flu or an illness or a fever. I suppose it could be a vaccine, but immunological activation. My son, when he experienced the onset of his type 1 diabetes, it wasn't a vaccine that did it. It was because, he got a cold, he got the flu, he got it was like what regular kids get every winter sometimes.
Mhm.
The analogy to autism is very strong. The brain, unlike the immune system, the brain starts developing a little earlier, but the critical stage of brain development is in last trimester, first year or so of life. It could even be 3 years. And if the brain is not operating with full mitochondrial function, then it becomes primed for autism that could then be triggered. That is, the onset could be triggered by an immunological event like the vaccines. So, vaccines don't cause autism, they reveal autism. That's a very difficult message to interpret, to even get a handle on, because we don't have any longitudinal study like they did in Finland that tracked kids for years and tracked the mitochondrial state of their mothers and their own state. And it would take decades to create that data. However, what we do know is that mitochondrial therapies will ameliorate the presentation of symptoms of autism. So you give an autistic child CoQ10, which supports mitochondrial function in the Krebs cycle, and their symptoms of autism improve. You give them L-carnitine, same thing. There's a doctor here in Phoenix who's had some success with operating in the folate acid or giving folate. That is improving the function of folate within the body because mitochondria depend upon folate. And he's had some success improving the symptoms or treating symptoms of autism in these children. So this is what's happening yesterday. This is real time that you're getting this. Every once in a while, there is an epiphany that comes from connecting what would otherwise be resident in different parts of the university or different parts of the hospital that never talk to one another and don't think they have any reason to talk to one another. And the synthesis of these two disparate ideas can result in a new idea that, that reveals some underlying basic principle. Now, I got to write this up. I got to send it to Jay Bhattacharya. I got to send it to Kennedy. And I got to say, this is where you should be looking. You don't have to look at everything anymore. Just look at the mitochondria.
Yeah, awesome. That's a huge.
And we'll see what happens.
Thing.
So, and, you know, if you're thinking about an update, you know, what's the next book going to be? It depends upon how people respond to this new article on autism. If it gains traction and gets a lot of response, then the next book will be Uncommon Brain. And it will talk about dementia and Alzheimer's and autism and these neurological disorders. It will talk about mood disorders. It will talk about personality disorders. It will talk about how we treat them. Because now that we understand the origins, we know what to do. Let's fix the mitochondria in the kids who are not neurotypical because they don't have the energy being produced by the mitochondria to fuel the additional thinking, the additional processes that they require to become more typical.
Yeah. Wow. I mean, the whole brain thing, there's so much there with that, just with what we were talking about as far as the mental health and the cold. And then if the autistic situation can be set up because of possibly, I mean, think of how many vaccines they're giving now compared to what they were giving even 20
Way too many.
years ago.
Yeah, I mean, there's no question that the cost benefit on the vaccines is way out of whack. The costs are way too high and the benefits are way too low. But with regard to autism, I believe it is wrong. It is a misconception to say that the vaccines cause the autism. The vaccines trigger the autism that is already extant in the structure of the brain.
Right. Because there's so much going on in here. When I took biochemistry and you think, wow, we know this much out of what's really happening, right? And here we are trying to make sense of it. And
so if anybody gets to the end of this podcast and then they've got the first public explanation of my hypothesis on autism and how my experience with type 1 diabetes informs that hypothesis. And I don't know if maybe I'll put it on Twitter and get banned again. Who knows what happens here? Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for sharing. I find that very
pleasure.
exciting. And I love how you frame things. And in this book, you made it very easy for people who are not used to looking at these types of words and research to be able to follow. So
I hope so. I hope it's accessible and highly cited.
Yes, very highly cited. And there are people who actually look at those.
I'm glad.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Cindy. I'll talk to you soon.